Začnemo. Torej, lepo pozdravljeni. V angleščini bom moral govoriti. Nice to have you with us, Mr. Tamás. Gašper Mikliš Tamás is, maybe probably you've heard of him. I mean, he was here many times already in Slovenia. He gave interviews. He is one of the, I would say, most prominent dissidents now in Hungary. He writes a lot. He raises his voice whenever this is possible. He was a dissident already in the 80s, protesting against communist regime and so on. He was even then a member of parliament in the beginning of the 90s. Another thing I have to mention that he got a book here in Slovenia last year. That's the book. It's called Communism After the Year 89, and it's basically a book about post-fascism. These are his essays that he wrote, and they're translated in Slovenian, and it's very of course, interesting reading. Now, my first question would be: you came here, of course, to support the protests that will be held tomorrow. Simple question: why did you come? I mean, it's an effort. You have to take the transportation means. It's not. You have to decide for this. Why did you do it? Why did you say yes, let's say like this? You have to turn it on, I think.
Well, because you asked me, so.
But there are some other reasons, I guess.
Yes, and well, there are several reasons. Well, first, of course, in this respect, I'm an old-fashioned leftist, and I think that solidarity is one of the first commandments of a person on the left. Secondly, I think that the situation in Europe in general and in East Central Europe in special is very dangerous. Actually, maybe not so dangerous in Slovenia, interestingly enough. And at least, I mean, in comparison. And thirdly, there is indeed an important historical change going on that might persuade us all to change our strategies and tactics. And let me just tell you in a very few words, what do I consider to be a major historical change in the history of Europe. And here I will be again very old-fashioned and tell you a few very classical bromides here. Since 1815, since the Holy Alliance, it has never happened that the European balance of powers had not been sustained by the English-speaking nations. After Napoleon, it was Britain and later America that with its influence, for better, for worse, has indeed tried to keep Europe going, making it safe for capital, for liberal order, for America, call it as you wish. But it has been only the external forces, America, England, and Russia, and Soviet Russia, who have saved Europe of fascism, which continent was not willing to save itself from fascism. Resistance against fascism was near to zero. Drôle de guerre, you know, i.e. no war, you know, translated roughly. And, you know, this was during 60 years, the Cold War, which was a pretty warm peace, where the tension between the Soviet Union and the Anglo-American powers kept a peace in Europe that had many failings and many negative features to it, but these countries where we live would be still a field of ruins without it. That's pretty certain. And that was the balance between the Soviet Union and America and Britain. And now that the Soviet Union doesn't exist any longer, socialism in this East European form doesn't exist any longer, and which is even more important, the Western workers' movement has been definitively defeated. All this system of complicated balances has been broken down, and England and America have turned their backs on Europe. This has never happened since Waterloo. Okay? And this is a very important news. There's no real pressures from the great powers to keep the continent peaceful. And not to speak of the better-known European, intra-European processes about which I don't need to tell you. I wanted to emphasize something that is not discussed very much. So at the moment, what has not been allowed since 1945, the road of the extreme right to power is open. It has not been open. Whatever the disadvantages of the Cold War, this was not possible. There was a deal between capital and the proletariat, called the welfare state and called peaceful coexistence. Okay, these two were the two important features. There's a pact of the Soviet system and of the Western communist parties and trade unions and so on with the capital, which kept the development as we know it, consumer society, etc., all that. And with a modicum of freedom that allowed some sort of ideological pluralism in the West, and even in some other places a bit. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that this was paradise compared to what's going on now. If you value stability, if you value steady development of income, etc., civilizational goods, public transport, technology, pensions, paid holidays, hygiene, secular schools, all this. Because as we all know from the whole history of European capitalism, the democratic and liberal sides of capitalism would have never developed without the pressure of the workers' movement. We would never have had universal suffrage without the pressure of the social democracy in the 19th century, so on and so forth. Such pressures, neither from outside nor from inside, they don't exist. They don't exist practically. And capitalism fills the horizon. It has no real enemy. There's no real adversary, potent, strong adversary, either outside or inside. Hence, a radicalization of the system is perfectly possible. It is the only power that exists. Who will stop the extreme right? Looking at the most European elections, apparently nobody. I witnessed last year, as I told you half an hour ago, I witnessed the elections in Austria last year. I happened to be there. And I could see that although the right, which the differences between so-called conservative and so-called extreme rights are just not worth mentioning, they're basically the same, a little bit of style, difference in style, some people won't spit on the street, but and so you could see exactly what I find problematic in all these protests in Ljubljana. There was no fear. There was no fear. People even did not realize that all the things that they allegedly appreciate and cherish, security, comfort, You know, Austria, you know, good food, you know, clean streets, all that, is in danger. Is in danger. Really, nothing much has happened. I had a conversation by chance with some influential people within the Serbian community in Vienna, mostly workers actually, and they'd say that they will vote for the FPÖ, for the neo-fascists. And I said, are you totally crazy? But these people are, you know, chauvinists. They're against you. I mean, you know, just the sound principle of self-interest should make you vote for somebody else. I said, no, we hate Muslims. I said, okay, right, okay, you go on hating Muslims. And indeed, Mr. Strache hates Muslims too. But he hates Serbs too. So, well, what's your point? You know, doesn't matter. But, you know, he'll kick you out from the country. Your social privileges will be reduced. Your life will be made a misery. Fuck Turks. Okay. Right. So, you know, this is, and you know, and these people were reliable voters of the Social Democratic Party. And the Social Democrats would not tell them that don't do this, because they won't be in the suspicion that they would actually support any kind of minority ethnic group of whatever description. That means losing votes. Now, of course, after they could see that all this victory of the extreme right is not a joke, now they have begun to talk about, you know, Christian Stern on 1st of May, you know, the fascists, and let's red flags again, and all. Too late. Too little, too late. So it's not even fair. And so the problem is that if you are indeed determined to resist the extreme right of whatever kind, they come in many guises and many varieties, you have to take into account all this, that the success of the far right is not just a success owing to propaganda, to cunning, to misleading people. Well, that too, of course, but there's nothing new. And so why do they win now? They're telling these lies in the last 100 years. They don't always win. Why do they win now? And they win now because, of course, you know, the consensus against oppression is broken. It's broken. And it is broken for a very simple reason, that those forces that made this impossible have been domesticated. You know, that's an old term from Trotsky. Actually, you know, how the working class has been domesticated. He was fearing that then. Yeah. He didn't live long. You know, he was a fortunate man. He was killed with an ice pick and didn't live to see all this shit. And the thing is that you know, and it was not only to praise people on the left. Hannah Arendt had a very important point against fascism in her writings, in which she said, what was the great mistake in Germany in the 20s and 30s of the Social Democratic and the Communist parties and other leftist groups? They always considered, for example, that Hitler's anti-Semitism was a ruse, was a cunning trick to break the front of the class struggle and to mislead people and to redirect people's hatred against capitalism to the Jews. And nobody took it seriously that Hitler wanted actually to kill the Jews. It was not a ruse. He was not lying. He really wanted to exterminate the Jews. Look at a much milder example today everybody said that all those ideas of Mr. Trump that he presented in the election campaign, well, just, campaign slogans, it doesn't, it's not important. He would never do that. He has since executed all his ideas and kept all his promises. He was absolutely serious about it, and he's extremely successful in, of course, destroying everything. But but he said that he was going to destroy everything. He was elected on that manifesto that he was going to destroy, American bourgeois democracy, and here he goes. And and also stopped the United States from being a world power, contributing to danger of war, etc. Okay. Also, he doesn't believe in global warming, and so there is none, and politically. So what I mean is here that we are witnessing a turn in history. All those paternal forces, all those daddies, with their nuclear weapons, the Brezhnevs and the Reagans and all these people, they don't exist any longer. They don't exist any longer. The Georges Marchais and the Palmiro Togliatti and all these people who kept the order by domesticating the working class, right? No, those people don't exist. So no world order is possible, and that means that you and I and everybody will have to create something that will stop Europe from becoming fascist, because nobody else will do it in our stead, as indeed they were doing it. It's not true that they weren't. After all, Stalin and Churchill and so on fought Hitler. We know that Churchill was a racist, that nobody could persuade him even to call a cabinet meeting to discuss the famine in India, because he didn't consider, the danger of 5 million niggers dying as a serious subject for debate, etc. We know all this. Still, in Europe, the thing has been defeated and been kept out until now. It isn't any longer. So these are the stakes. This is why I'm running to Ljubljana. Probably, as you told me, and other, Janša probably won't be a prime minister. So what's the panic about? It's not Janša.
So, yeah, I don't know. Maybe you probably know, but Steve Bannon was in Hungary this week, the architect of the Trump administration. Now he's in Italy, and basically he said that he was fascinated by Europe. He said it's a great place. He didn't know that it's so good here. And he also said, like, Orban, he is Trump before Trump. Orban was Trump, like avant-garde of the Trumpism already here. But the thing I want to then ask you is, when you listen to these people, let's take the perspective. You took now the perspective of the analytical perspective. If you took the perspective of a normal people who are listening to these guys, their discourse is quite convincing, and I will tell you, and I'm sure that maybe Orban also in Hungary, when he speaks, people say, yeah, that's really true. I will tell you what Bannon says. He says, for example, he was talking about Davos parties, so the elitist groups, Goldman Sachs, that they are not doing anything for workers, for normal people, elitist. He was speaking continuously about elites, and I met your spokesperson of the Orban government, Mr. Kovac, I think his name is, and he was speaking the same language. He was telling like this: this elitist Western people, Soros, Soros is elitist, representing elite. They're doing everything for themselves. Their discourse is supporting maybe corporate stuff. They're taking profit, but we want to do something for people. We are here from people. We are patriotic. And the same Bannon. I mean, he's if you listen to him, and maybe also to Kovac, he looks to me like anti-globalist in the 2000, fighting McDonald's, the same stuff, and I guess this is why he wins the votes, because as you know, the support for these evil forces is not coming from racist. It's coming from voters who were voting for workers' parties before. So the question then is what do you think when you hear Orban speaking this nice language or and so on?
Well, actually, they don't use this language. For example, all this Bannon thing about Goldman Sachs and so on was not used by the Hungarian state propaganda. It wasn't even mentioned. Also, it's not true that it was the working class who voted for Trump. The average income of the Trump voters is significantly higher than that of the Clinton voters. That's simply not true. And still, enough voters have voted for Trump. So did a number of voters vote for Hitler. What's new? I mean, so he says that, that all these elites are against the people. Do you remember not remember, but do you know the Horst Wessel lead? Yeah, of course. Reaktion und Marxismus erdrücken. But reaction and Marxism to be defeated. Of course. You know that this term of Bannon's in the Breitbart News of cultural Marxism, that comes from Goebbels. It was called Kulturbolschewismus. And it was, socialism and capitalism are the two sides of the same coin, all based on instrumental rationality, all based on vulgar materialism. Marx is as much about money as Rothschild. I mean, what's new? And, that's just the oldest fascist talk. Again, that's not important because, that's totally asinine. And nobody in their right mind, if it stops for a moment, will believe such nonsense. But why is more successful than it has been for 60, 70 years? The far right was always saying this. And of course, there is one little atom of truth in that. Because you see, capitalism and bourgeois society are not the same thing. The actual class domination of the bourgeoisie is one thing, and the mechanism of capitalism is another. It is true that fascist governments have taken a lot of political power out of the hands of the bourgeoisie. That's true. But they haven't changed anything in the nature of exploitation and so on and so forth. And so in this respect, indeed, if you wish, indeed, fascism has been a force towards making politics more plebeian, to get out the Weberian elites as much as the Enlightenment elites from the functioning of the state, where they didn't have the time to do it very thoroughly. And the time comes now, especially in East European countries, where the Enlightenment elites and the Weberian bureaucracy is called, guess what? It's called communism. With the most astonishing idea that, that the old Enlightenment elites, the rationalist, planning, calculating, improving, road building, book publishing, literacy making, reformers of the most characteristic Enlightenment bent, as indeed the question of building socialism didn't arise. So that would indeed represent the most subversive ideas ever cross the mind of humankind. That's ridiculous. Nevertheless, so we have a certain, because of real socialism being compromised, the idea is now that indeed, so Bannon could be happy in today's Europe, because for the first time in a very long time now, from the 20s, this hasn't happened, the right has understood that socialism being defeated, its enemy is again the French Revolution. And here you ought to read the Hungarian right-wing press. They are not attacking Marxists, and oh well, occasionally. They don't attack, they attack the Jacobins, they attack Rousseau, they attack D'Alembert, and soon they will be attacking Descartes. And no, I'm not joking. I'm not joking at all. At all. You know who is the most popular thinker in Hungary today? It's Oswald Spengler, and Ludwig Klages, and what's his name? Evola, Julius Evola, you know, and who has been considered to be the inspiration behind the Jobbik party that has been now the ally and the partner of the liberal parties in the latest election, with the results you know. This much about coalitions with the right. Okay, very well. And you see, so now indeed the fight is going again, nothing new. I mean, Lukács, for God's sake, in his worst period, in his Stalinist book of Destruction of Reason, he describes this tendency of the right, of being irrationalist, being anti-enlightenment. What's new? So yes, so I think that Mr. Bannon is indeed quite justified in being happy in East Central Europe today. So am I justified to be unhappy in the same place, and for the same reasons.
If I remember, you wrote once this: when you are critical, you're which happens. You are, let's say, of course, critical towards Orban, but I think you are even more critical towards people, as you said before. Why are they not opposing this? Why are they letting this happen? And okay, I have to go on then a bit more. My question is longer, connected with this. So in our pre-election campaign, Janša said, "You're all stupid here. What are you telling about Orban? Look in Brussels. In Brussels, there are soldiers with arms walking on the street, and this is the situation there because they let the migrants in. Look at Budapest. There are tourists there. Everything is beautiful, and you've seen the poster. Yeah, okay. So, you know, but so we at Mladina, we made a bit of research, and there was one survey. It's OECD is making a survey, life quality survey, and basically they found out that nowadays they were researching fear. And they found out that Hungarians are now the most, fear is there at the top. So there was a question, for example, if you walk alone on the street, are you afraid? And Mexicans, they shoot each other. They said 47% are afraid to walk. Hungarians 50. Half of the population now is in Hungary is afraid to walk. Yeah, and the politicians in the past seems like they were offering programs saying we are doing this and this so that you live happier. I think looks like Orban is in fact using fear. It's not using some positive economic stuff, I don't know, to make people happier. No, it doesn't need to. He is in power because he's doing the opposite. He's spreading fear. So
yes. Listen.
This is why people are, maybe you say, they're letting this happen.
Well, here I wasn't consequent enough. After all, we know why people don't resist Mr. Orban. Still, one is also a citizen and a moral being and cannot bear this. So, on the one hand, I'm objective and skeptical. On the one hand, I'm objective and skeptical. On the other hand, I'm subjective and indignant. Sorry about that. But talking seriously, well, he does something for the population. He's in contradistinction of what he says about himself. He's an orthodox neoliberal. We have a flat tax. It's a very classical politics in favor of the upper middle class and so on and so forth. The working class and everybody else is neglected. The underclass is kept under tight police control. And do you know that, you may have heard about this social system in Hungary, that there's no unemployment benefit, there's no dole, zero, but people can apply for public works, cleaning and so on and so forth. So they get some money if they're unemployed, and these monies are distributed by local government and so on and so forth. And which is the state institution that administers these public works in order to keep the unemployed happy? Well, it's the Ministry of the Interior. It is the police that is organizing public works. Anyway, so, that's a very classic politics, that's a Horthy style neoliberalism, if I may coin a phrase. And talking about fear, well, yes, of course, the fear of the unknown races and so on and so forth, and the foreigners, but this fear is a specific fear, and it has a name. It's called racism. It's not some unknown and mysterious force. It's as old as the hills. It's called racism. And its characteristics are very familiar, quite from the olden times, in the 19th century. Do you remember who were the first people in this part of the world that came from the East, wore strange clothes? The men had long beards. The women had their hair covered, like my grandmother, who was Jewish, and, an Orthodox Jewish old woman. And, they talked in strange tongues. They had strange religious habits. They were fundamentalists. How were the Jews being criticized at the beginning of the 19th century, at the end of the 18th century? Fanatics. Well, that was the idea. Voltaire spoke about the Jews. They would bring us back, they would bring us back to the Middle Ages. They are not enlightened modern people. They are blind believers, fanatics, religious fundamentalists. Again, what's new? The exact same phrases and images used in the 1830s, 1840s against the Galician and Russian Jews who came to the West from the Russian persecutions are used now literally identically against the Muslim religious people, Exactly. Do you think that such phrases, for example, that modern racists like the French government of today are saying that it's really terrible that jihadi Muslims don't respect women? Of course, that was said. That was said before. That how is it possible that women are not taken seriously? They have to sit separately in the synagogue, or whatever. They had to cut their hair, etc., etc., etc. And they were married against their will. I mean, religious people, deeply religious people, are quite similar. That all these moral behavior concerning a lot of aspects of individual moral life are quite similar. Not all, but many are very similar. All these conservative religious societies have similarities. So, so I don't think it's such a mystery that people are afraid. Afraid? That's also called hatred, That's not so simple. And if you think that somebody coming from the East, fleeing a war and other unpleasant aspects of life, is really intent on killing us and destroying our society, well, it's totally irrational, as you know, of course. But this, of course, expresses something that is not so irrational. This expresses something, the conviction that alien cultures and alien races are so fundamentally different from us, inferior, of course, worse than us, that this is what endangers our felicity, our integrity, our self-regard and so on and so forth. You know, has always been the essence of racism. Same thing. What has won the election for Trump? Not this, not that, but he used a language against blacks that nobody dared to use in 40 years. And the racism was there. It has been tamed, it has been domesticated, it has been, you know, all that. But now what is to stop it? The great emancipatory forces that were also critical of capitalism and so on are so weakened, and so on. I won't go on. I said this before. And so, yes, there's some fear-mongering, as to describe it, but also this is not any other. If indeed there would be a fear of foreigners, what would happen to the tourists? Why are the tourists not mobbed and lynched? And why there are no pogroms against very unpleasant American tourists who are so loud that I cannot live? You know, I live 2 minutes from the chain bridge in Budapest, in the midst of the tourist district. Let me tell you, it's terrible. But, you know, but is anybody lynching the American tourists and the German tourists? If it's indeed fear of the foreigner, come on. They're white. They're white and they're rich. So it doesn't matter. It's not any old foreigner. No, no, no. These are the inferior races. These are the darker-skinned Oriental and Southern races that have always been, since racism exists, it has not always existed, has been always the enemy. And also some of the nasty undercurrents, such as that the dark races, also very much part of the anti-Semitic imaginary, are somehow sexually dangerous. You know, that's nothing. So, you know, yes, fear, hatred, but I mean, this is racism. It's not fear of anybody.
Where do you think the opposition is now coming? Opposition in the terms of, let's say, geography. Like you said that in Hungary, now it's prevalent the fear from not the fear, the hatred towards the West. So like the government sees the West as the enemy, from where I could conclude that maybe West is now the opposition. So but this is now geographical, but then also psychological, from which people who is now opposing these evil forces.
Do you remember from your studies the long line of the National Socialist German Workers' Party about the corrupt, decadent England bought up by the Jews? England was the bastion of international Jewry. I mean, yeah, the hatred against the West is a permanent feature of fascism. The West, actually, it is only in the last 30 years that Germany is considering itself a Western country. It was never the case. It was never the case before. Mitteleuropa was an idea invented in Germany, and it mostly referred to itself. Yes, of course. You know, Friedrich Naumann. Very interesting, actually, that the foundation of the German liberals is called the Friedrich Naumann Stiftung. Friedrich Naumann was one of the nastiest German nationalists. Anyway. And he invented this idea of Mitteleuropa. He was a Lutheran pastor and a nasty piece of work. Anyway, and so you see the idea that the poisoned West, of course, like after England, it was, of course, America that was the Judaized, poisoned, not any longer really Western country in the sense of Charlemagne and whatever. And today, of course, it is, the Angela Merkels and the Jean-Claude Junckers of this world who are self-hating white people who would like to see all the women folk being violated by, these wily Oriental gentlemen. That was, of course, the old wogs. That was the old English term for Indians and such, the wogs, the wily Oriental gentlemen. Okay, very, very witty. And, and so that's what's going on. So the West stands for mongrelization, again, a term from the 30s, America and the South, the mixed race people will come back. Mongrelization, that's what it stands for. We don't keep our civilization, our race whole and so on. Orbán said very, 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 very openly, we don't want a multicolored society. Not multicultural. We don't want a multi. And we are Christians, not in the sense of religion, said he, intelligent man. Not in the sense of religion, in the sense of culture, civilization, in other words, politics. What does mean in contemporary Hungary the word Christian? It means non-Jewish. What does the word Magyar mean today in Hungary? Non-Roma. Well, these are negative terms. They had become negative terms whose meaning has been changed. All these changes in meaning, that of course has been changed in other countries too, with similar politics, are negative and destructive and have very little to do even with traditional nationalism. And for example, today in Romania, another country I know for biographical reasons, I grew up in Romania, as a Hungarian minority member, so I always had the best everywhere. And so for example, today, if in the official parlance they say a Romanian Christian, that means somebody who belongs to the Orthodox Church, meaning they're not Hungarian. That's the idea. Of course, a Christian means somebody who's not Hungarian. Hungarians, of course, are Catholics and Protestants, but those are not Christian in our sense. Our sense, of course, being ethnic. And yes, so these are very serious. This is a very serious business, and I could go on, but it's very hot here, and we'll have to finish. But for example, you see, we don't only have this kind in Hungary. We don't, and this is a very good example because it's coming everywhere. And so this is what I'm telling you, because Hungary in itself, it's interesting for me, but not necessarily for you. So there are also other versions of ethnic hatred and ethnicism, which I call it in my studies. For example, the liberals, not the Orbánists, have other hostilities. They are mostly opposed to the Orthodox nations. Balkans, Byzantium, Russian servility, all this, the Tsars, the Stalins, all that, the all bowing. A nation that made such great revolutions, being a servile people, that's quite extraordinary. Never mind. But you know how nationalism is, yeah. And so so Romanians and Serbs and Bulgarians and Greeks are all these, Eastern Christianity, the schismatics that didn't have somehow the spunk to live up to the heroic ideal of Christianity. What? Heroic ideal? A religion that turns the other cheek? Anyway. So, so these things, of course, are absurd, but quite influential in the anti-Russian propaganda, in the anti-Romanian, anti-Serb propaganda, and so on and so forth. So, we have all these scale, and again, why do we? Who has the courage to stand up and say such things as, all people are equal? Scandalous, isn't it? All people have been born equal. Or everybody is equal before God. Everybody is equal before the law. I'm not only mentioning, proletarian internationalism. I'm just mentioning the classical morality that has been the case in our great traditions, in the Judeo-Christian and Greco-Roman traditions, that all stand for equality of humankind. And this idea now sounds totally crazy. So even in this country, which compared to mine is pretty nice and comfy and sweet and all that. But still you have these posters, copied from Hungary, showing a crowd of dark-skinned people storming here and doing what? They want to eat? Unheard of.
I'll have just one question, then I will give the microphone to...
Can't we open a window?
Yeah, maybe the doors there. So because we are now, let's say we are...
We are supposed to be humanists.
Yeah. We are tomorrow demonstrations will be, and I asked you before, who do you think the opposition is coming from? And because many people give up, many people give up. They said nothing can be changed and so on. And I remember, and I think that you are an optimist. I remember once you said, I will prove now to you. I remember once you said, even in the darkest ages, in the very difficult times, there was a guy named Voltaire who kind of made then a revolution. It is possible that it's somebody, that one man stands and changes something, and you came here to support the demonstrations, and some people could say, so what, what will change? Should we demonstrate or not? And I guess you are asking these questions yourself, and many Hungarians now for the past 10 years. Maybe what are your answers? How to, is it worth to oppose? How to oppose? You said there were times when one man could change the whole system, and I think you believe this, and therefore you are saying what you're saying.
Well, look, I don't think that moral indignation and moral opposition are worthless. Very seldom successful, but they're not worthless. Moral acts are useful morally, and that's not nothing. So why didn't I participate in the public protests in Hungary the last time? Because they were morally ambiguous and because they were politically vague. They didn't say, for example, that Mr. Orbán is refusing some wretched, miserable people, even, say, 1,000-2,000 people, to be fed and housed and clothed in our country, and we invited them cordially to come, and we will welcome them. No. What would they say? It is not nice of Mr. Orbán to do this hate-mongering. This is a very bad style. You shouldn't talk in this tone of voice about foreign people. You shouldn't use people's bad instincts and fears, all that. So you should be a more stylish racist. That's just, really, I'm really not impressed by this. And so real moral indignation and real moral protest can be effective. But if it's a moral protest is ambiguous, well, that's a contradiction in terms. And so you see, and indeed, even miracles can happen. 1905, do you remember from your studies of the revolution, Pope Gapon. Pope Gapon was an Orthodox priest, in St. Petersburg. Also, he was a secret police agent. And yes, subsequently has been found out. And he, because he was a man of Zubatov, who was the chief of police in St. Petersburg, tried to channel the workers' protest, who went to the Tsar, scored with icons and flags and saying, "Oh, Your Majesty, be kind to your Russian workers," and so on and so forth. But what did His Majesty do? He was shooting at these people, and people said, "We came with the icons, the Christian icons that we share with you, and you are shooting at us." So a 2 years revolution broke out that has indeed broken the backbone of Tsarism, etc., etc. You remember what happened in the 22nd of December 1989 in Bucharest, when everybody was called by Mr. Ceausescu to demonstrate on his behalf, and people went on the square and said, "Long live Ceausescu! Long live Ceausescu!" What? Down with Ceausescu! Down with Ceausescu! Okay, so so such moral miracles happen and can be occasionally effective, but you cannot organize such things. What you can rationally predict and organize are not things of this kind that are unpredictable. Well, this is why they're miracles, okay? They're unpredictable. And so what opposition can do, I will disappoint you because I will tell you some very boring things. What an opposition can do, especially in such difficult times as these, first demand, I think, in my long experience of opposing this and that and the other, clarity. Clarity is more important than anything. You can have aims that are limited. You can have aims that are modest. There are times in which you cannot storm the heavens, okay. But those aims ought to be presented clearly as modest, circumscribed, provisional aims. So, for example, if you go together tomorrow there, obviously, such a demonstration against some very unattractive political forces won't change the real nature of society, obviously. It cannot, but we shouldn't pretend. This is a defensive demonstration. This wants to stop things from getting even worse. Okay, nothing wrong with this. Okay, of course, sometimes keeping things moderately bad, it's quite something, if you don't want them to deteriorate further. But you have to say that clearly. That if Janez Janša loses the elections, doesn't mean that Slovenia will be a clean-cut, honest, egalitarian, democratic, social state. Of course not. Okay, we cannot do this now, but we shouldn't pretend that such things, indeed, even preventing Mr. Janša from becoming Prime Minister, which is a worthy aim. We should prevent that from happening. Obviously, he's a bad man and he's a stupid idiot. Okay, he shouldn't be there. Very good. But moderate aims are moderate aims, and they can indeed energetically represented and pursued, but not lying. So that's, and not lying especially to ourselves. So that's one thing I should propose. Clarity. And second is taking yourself seriously. One of the great dangers in this part of the world is, as you know, again, it's boring, it's political cynicism. When indeed we had allowed ourselves to be convinced that politics is only about power, well, in what sense? You can have indeed conquer power and use it for wonderful purposes. It is possible. You'll be surprised. But it's power, it's money, it's manipulation, it's etc., etc., etc. So, and then because it seems also incredible, then other vague ideas will be seeping in. See, for example, what you quoted very rightly, all this talk about elitism and so on. What do you mean? In a system of representative government, which is based on appointing leaders with enormous powers. The powers of a modern state today, the influence on people's lives is larger than the power in a medieval kingdom, in which power was much more distributed between various factors. Also, social oppression in medieval society was different, not necessarily bigger than today. Peasants worked 4 or 5 months a year. Okay? Wouldn't you like that? To work only 3, 4, 5 months a year and be free otherwise? If people didn't want to live in oppressive families and they didn't want to do physical work, they could become monks and nuns. There was an escape, a social escape of monasticism that has no parallel in modern society. Okay. And so, you know, the power of nobility and of dynasty, it was brutal but small and very limited. Today, when the state has an influence about your salary, your pension, your income, your taxes, your employment, your health, your schooling, your culture, the regulation of traffic. Yeah? Who said anything about traffic in the early Middle Ages? Okay, people just went on as they thought fit, if they could. Okay, and you know, so these people are enormously powerful. And what do we consider liberal societies? That there's an ultimate guarantee that if these people elected fail miserably, they can be exchanged once every 4 or 5 years. Well, it's a very feeble, better than nothing, obviously. Also, the independent courts and so on. And these are very modest things. Of course, these countries are ruled by elites, unavoidably, because the system entrusts elites to govern. That's the way it is. So talking about elitism while believing in parliamentarism, etc., 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 is really, it's a lie. It's mendacious. It's insincere. I mean, just forget it. And you know, the thing is that, but even this is now in danger. And now I really will come back to Mr. Orbán. Do you know that Hungary has been living in a state of emergency in the last 2 years? It's called a state of emergency in the case of extreme danger of immigration. That's the legal term. Are there immigrants in Hungary? None. Never mind. Okay. And this, of course, gives the police extreme powers. The new Police Powers Act, stipulates that the police can control, investigate, and detain any person likely to have committed or to commit in the future crimes or misdemeanors, and persons linked to such persons. Okay? That's the law of the land. This is something much more stringent than the regulations of Pinochet during the military coup in Chile in September 1973. But of course there's no resistance, so they don't have any opponents to shoot because there's nobody to shoot, you know, because nobody resists. Most people don't even know that there's a state of emergency in the country. So this, and now built on this, the famous Stop Soros Act that will be passed by our glorious parliament, elected democratically, freely, that will stipulate the following. All sorts of nonsense being said about this and that, but what's the essence? Those persons and those organizations who will aid and abet illegal immigration and will offer aid and succor and assistance to such persons that might want, maybe, to enter the national territory illegally, will be punished by 1 year imprisonment. This includes a lawyer that would act for an immigrant. But because the law is formulated such, even before the court finds that this immigrant has the right to be accepted as a refugee or not, even if the court establishes that he was justified in coming to Hungary, his lawyer will go to prison for a year. What does the opposition say? Well, this is a real bad work of codification. What kind of lawyers do you employ, Mr. Prime Minister, to come up with such an asinine document? Etc. Anyway, why is that? Because there's a consensus. How are consensus constructed? You all know, I won't go into the social philosophy, you know very well, you know, It's force, it's persuasion, it's interest, and a combination of all of this. But we are in a position in which even conservative, authoritarian people's ideas have been violated without the slightest resistance to speak of. Everything goes on just like before. You know, what is my association about this? You know, this is something a short story I read a few 20 years ago, and then I read up about this. What do you think happened in Budapest when, in broad daylight, 300,000 Jews have been taken to the camps, taken first to the to a factory, empty factory, and then to the trains and deported, and everybody knew what will happen because, of course, these people didn't have any luggage. Their flats have been given over to other people, so it was quite clear they won't return. Obviously, everybody knew what was going to happen. And what happened in Budapest? And I was, by the short story writer, I was informed first that just look what happened in those days. The cinemas were playing. The theaters were playing. The cabaret was playing. The soccer championship went on. New fashions have been presented. And there appeared a little book that was very successful in August 1944, when all this happened. The end result was 600,000 people murdered. A new little manual of flirtation for Christian girls, religious girls who still wanted to flirt. So what is the good method of flirtation? It was 44. You know, the Americans, the English, and the Russians are bombing Budapest. So this is how it's going. So it's all possible. So it's not only these laws of Orbán, that's nothing compared to 1944. This is absolutely nothing. And so, you know, resistance is a combination of various factors, one of which is force. And force depends in politics about what do you believe about your own force, your own power, your own truth, etc., etc. Of course, that's how it begins. It's also a moral thing. Don't forget that also thinking about your own justified interest is a moral thought. And so, you know, you have to link people's legitimate self-interest, and legitimate self-interest is not identical with selfishness. Legitimate self-interest, sense of justice, sense of proportion, instinct for liberty, these things exist. They are not sufficient, but most certainly at the beginning of organizing, these moral feelings and moral instincts are important. So, you know, yes, I think that opposition is and resistance is possible. And but also it needs some things that I don't want to persuade you of. We haven't known until now in history any effective, until now at least, any effective resistance, any revolution, any real uprising against oppression without theory. Without a theory. That theory oughtn't to be very complicated, I don't mean that. But when in the peasant wars and so on and so forth, people had a very precise idea of justice. It was based, of course, on theology, on a very rudimentary theology, biblical theology, and that was something that people understood. Not only that was true, because if the church said that it was A, true, and B, was not represented by the church and by the kings and by the nobles. It was us who took into our hands to fulfill the promises contained in the Gospels. So that's also, therefore, also a question of dignity, of self-confidence, of believing that your rulers and your leaders and your masters are not of a higher quality than yourself. The simplest things, but they are not easy, as it seems. We see now in this new reactionary turn of politics that we were used and even misled by some of the semblances after '89, when people seemed to be fond of, human rights and civic liberties and such, and we thought this was strong enough to keep us from an authoritarian or dictatorial or tyrannical or quasi-fascist or post-fascist or whatever. It wasn't strong enough. So the whole thing has to begin anew. Well, this also has happened. There are defeats in history. It is our bad fortune to be members, both you and me, of a defeated generation. But it won't last forever. So our role is to be impatient and say that we too, even I, who am older than you, I would like to live a little in a more dignified and free society. And I don't want it only for my children. No, I also want it for myself.
Okay, thank you very much that you came. We are Zdaj, če ima kdo še kakšno vprašanje, lahko zastavi. Bi imel kdo? Koga kaj zanima?
Okay, thank you very much. It was, I think, I speak in behalf of everyone here, that it was really interesting and inspiring, no? But yeah. Anyway, I would have a small objection considering Lukács' Destruction of Reason. I really fail to see why this should be such a bad book, because I mean, I think it's extremely lucid social criticism. But my question.
Do you know who liked it?
Who?
Leo Strauss.
Okay, so yeah, pity. Yeah. No. But still, yeah, my question was different, no? Because you mentioned, and it was really interesting, that now, after this restoration of '89 and something, that these are Jacobins and even Rousseau and soon to be Descartes that are being demonized, no? And I assume also Hungarian Jacobins like Martinović or. Yeah. Okay. No, but my question was different. No, still, what is like the formal opinion, no, like this revisionist opinion on, for example, Hungarian bourgeoisie in 48, 49, because it was on the one hand really progressive, like the most of these so-called Central European bourgeoisies, apart from the German, no, and it was really tolerant, also considering Jews and something. But on the other hand, it also started like this. It gave frame or maybe the pattern to Hungarian nationalism and patriotism, like with Petőfi and Lajos Kossuth and something. And what is like the formal? What do they teach in schools about this ambiguous stream?
Oh well, God, it's so simple. It's 48 is described as a Hungarian-Romanian war. Basically, well, of course. There were traitors, the nationalities, they were traitors, they betrayed us to Austria. The Austrians were bad. Well, they were good because they were conservative, but they were also bad because they weren't Hungarians. The Russians came to occupy Hungary, that was very bad because they were Russians. But Kossuth went too far in declaring the Republic, this sort of thing. And that indeed, what indeed mattered, of course, was Jelačić, etc., 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 etc. And at the same time, the fact that the rights of Transylvanian Romanians have been denied by the Hungarian nobility, although they had been asked for and alliance was offered by the Romanian leaders, well, that's totally under total silence. So, of course, it's just a nationalist historiography in which the liberal features of the revolution are totally obliterated.
Kossuth is bad guy.
No. He was a good nationalist, and he was a bit too radical because he would consider the Republic, and in principle he was in favor of distributing land to peasants and the liberation of the serfs, which actually hasn't happened in the revolution. It was the Austrian government during the autocratic system in '53 that actually freed the serfs. Dirty story. But yeah. So no. So the liberal tradition, which indeed it was a mainstream tradition of the Hungarian bourgeoisie and the Hungarian state, is kind of elitist, if you wish, but in the very concrete sense of, we had a suffrage in Hungary in the 19th century. 6.58% of the male population had the vote. So that's not much, is it? And et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was a very, very anti-democratic system. So no, so such traditions are not. No, actually, the cult goes ever back to medieval kings and so on.
Thank you.
You mentioned in beginning that Europe is now without any protection, and that we have to build this protection from beginning. So do you have any suggestion how we could start this?
Well, look, no, but for a reason. Because you see, the fact of the Holy Alliance and so on and so forth, and the Cold War and so on, that was the result of so many historical accidents too, that planning for such a concatenation of disparate events is just impossible. And also, of course, I have a great number of objections to this kind of outside control. Well, can you imagine me to be a partisan of the Holy Alliance? Well, hardly. But indeed, if we speak of stability, that of course that was a stable system, the Vienna Congress, and so no. But to have, a Europe that develops the medicine that would prevent it from becoming fascist, that would be nice. If nobody helps from the outside, because such interests are not. So really, nobody cares in the outside world whether our state systems or governments are, liberal democratic or moderate socialist or Nazi or whatever. Who cares? Really, do you think that the Chinese leaders care about that? Etc. Of course, nobody cares about that. And the question is, do we care sufficiently? And there are lots of things preventing us from caring. Well, one is something that I would talk about that because I experienced that myself. I know how rotten liberal democracy is. So, risking lots of things for liberal democracy, well, it's really what an idea. And still probably, if you are reasonable enough, you will see that the lesser evil is sometimes worth defending, not always. Sometimes it's worth defending. And indeed the lessons of the 1930s and 1940s teaches us that such things have to be considered very carefully from a strategic and political point of view. There's no patent solutions. We know how popular fronts ended, etc., which were actually betrayed by the French bourgeoisie and not by others. The French bourgeoisie preferred Hitler to the French proletariat. This much about sincere nationalism. And, well, actually, the French bourgeoisie always sided with the national enemy when they needed to. In 1871, didn't they side with the Prussians against the Paris Commune? Oh, well, nothing new again. So, so all these things. So, okay, should the left make, alliances with the democratic bourgeoisie again, knowing them to be like they are? These are not easy problems. And this inspires many good people on the left to be sometimes alarmingly indifferent towards what happens within bourgeois society. It's understandable. It's not, sometimes it's perfectly okay, and sometimes it's strategically wrong. It has to be concretely analyzed. There's no patent answer in all cases. And so on. So you see, no, I don't have a utopia for moderation. No. But this is because there are absolutely no utopias for moderation at all. Not only I don't have any, they are not in the world. Such things don't exist.
I have another question. Thank you for your beautiful thoughts you're sharing with us. So we have an election now in few days, and my question is, what is your opinion? How do we trust left parties at all after what happened in Greece? Because most of the people I know and would be traditional left, they would just vote against Janša, but they don't find anybody, representing them. They are searching for a voice. So, what do you think? What happened with the left, and how the people should consider that?
Well, I also have a very low opinion of Syriza, but let's be fair. They have been defeated. That's not treason. The fact that Tsipras has remained prime minister is in a very poor taste, but it's not very important. They have been defeated. Well, then they should have withdrawn and I would have had other ideas what to do after the defeat, but that's a secondary consideration. And what is happening to the left is a very difficult problem for various reasons. One of the reasons is that the left has been quite successful in this period of compromise I have described. The mental habits of European socialists, from social democrats to official communists, even to some groups of the so-called far right or revolutionary left and revolutionary left, are used to feel secure. That even if they're defeated, no death will come, no prison. There was a long, long peace. A few people went to prison in some parts. Not in Europe, not much really. Not after '56, not after the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party. So you see, really breaking with the system is psychologically very difficult, because the first revolutionary break has failed so lamentably. The revolutionary paradigm is equated in our historical fantasy with defeat. And rightly so. It has been defeated. Well, the revolutionary would say that, of course, it was defeated once, twice, thrice, but let's begin anew. La lotta continua. Okay. But not everybody is like that. And that's one thing. It's very important. It's very, very important. Secondly, don't forget that for a long time, anti-socialism, anti-communism had been a constituent part of what has been constructed as the new anthropology of modern society. I can't go on but one thing is that people appreciate more than anything else their personal space, be that property, be that family, be that profession, be that pursuit, be that enjoyment of nature, be that sexual passion, child rearing, that development of personality apart from public affairs and the general principles of the good are being pursued and sought by people in a natural way. This is what 90% of the people, from fascists to liberals, sincerely believe. And it's a general conviction that no action within the public realm has the dignity, the moral dignity of individuality and individual communication and dialogue and love and so on. Well, that's a monumental obstacle. So there's a great change in the moral psychology of the age that indeed prevents people from breathing. Not because people are stupider than their grandfathers and grandmothers. No. The thing is that they have to face difficulties of this nature that are enormous. And it's not just that the old style working class is not here again. The new style working class is here again. I mean, that's not is the major obstacle. The major obstacle is what we think about it. Why has, for example, this very annoying argument about the absence of a working class be so successful? Because we don't want a class-based revolutionism to break out again, because our moral sensibilities go against it. You know, that's why. That's why. And I can't go on that, but you see, these sort of things are very important. And of course, other things as well. For example, indeed, there are logistical difficulties in change of technology, etc., but still, and also, of course, there is also something else. The left is not different from anybody else from being disappointed in a number of things, not revolutionary things. Elections, representation of interests like trade unions, education. These were all methods, were supposed to be methods of improving our lot, socially, politically, morally, and so on, and they failed. So not only the disappointment in the great revolution, the great utopias, the great revolutionary movements, but also what has been offered in their stead that failed as well. So most people, especially the young, but not exclusively the young, say, oh, this is crap. We may be able to get rid of the Yansha and the local Yanshas everywhere if they seem threatening or intolerable, but nobody, and rightly, thinks that if you get rid of him, then life will be nobler, more beautiful, happier, and so on, because it won't. Okay, so it won't. Maybe it won't be worse. That's all. But that's little to get people committed, engaged, sacrificing, generous.
Yeah. Miklos, I'm so happy to see you here in Ljubljana. I think it was about 18 years ago that we ate a lunch together at a Central European University and talk about wonderful things. Everything was in front of us, and now the debacle happened. And so, anyway, a few months ago, I saw a wonderful Serbian film, a documentarian, that shows a very well-known Serbian professor of natural history who stood in front together with her students for years in the 90s on protests every evening together with the masses, and spoke not only to the students but to the public, and actually they were very, very creative force to manage eventually also to smash Milosevic and so. And this film inspired me very much of thinking how the university has been changed, and that we, until recently, believed that the university is also a Bastilla against neoliberalism, a strength that from which we can produce the capacity to fight and for liberation, and we are bitterly disappointed. University is just something that is we can just not count, and this is something that I wonder what are your thoughts about, also about the Hungarian universities, and also what to do with our universities nowadays.
Well, here I'm ignorant because I'm prohibited from teaching at Hungarian universities. I haven't set foot in Hungarian university for decades now, and when I was invited by a student organization once, then I was asked by the rector of that university not to give my talk, which I did. But the students who invited me had indeed such problems there that they had to depart that university. There was one occasion. And similar things. So I don't know much about Hungarian universities. My son teaches in the University of Budapest, a classical philologist, and what I hear from him is not very encouraging. But although there are quite a number of clever people there. And, you know, yeah, these things change. I don't know how it's going. You know, I'm ignorant. But one thing is that such things, such moral resistance of one kind or another, that can appear and reappear every time. You know, in the 1960s, people said that people were so materialist that no uprising was any longer possible. You know, all these, before revolutions, people always are writing articles that nothing will move for centuries and next day, bang. You know, so of course, so these things can happen today too, and so on. So I don't think that resistance is impossible. What the location should be, universities or not, I have absolutely no idea. I have no idea. We had this old utopia of revolutionary intellectuals. They might reappear, for all I know. I don't know.
Okay, lahko. I'd like to ask you about, are we morally justified to oppose strongly to the Janša coming to the power if we failed to oppose actual prime minister building the fence around the country, the fence that is drowning the people at this moment? And haven't we really lose this fight with Janša at the moment that we failed to resist these acts that were provided by the actual prime minister?
Well, that's a very good question, actually. And yes, of course, you are morally justified, of course, to fight somebody who seems even worse. But still, that's a very dispiriting state of affairs. That if somebody was doing it adroitly and with a civilized veneer of some kind, people were ready to put up with it without making a great noise. Still, of course, I don't read your language, but I know that compared to many other countries, there was some noise. At least, you know, people were writing and so on. But I mean, can you imagine that people like Gert Conrad, the famous dissident in Hungary, gave an interview to La Repubblica declaring that Orbán is quite right in building the fence and in keeping the refugees out, you know, one of the heroes of dissidents. Extraordinary. And similar things in other places. I had, and this might be my last answer because it's getting late, I got a phone call about 3 months ago saying that Slavoj Žižek has proposed my name to the publisher of one of his volumes in Budapest that was translated in Hungarian, and should I, do I want to talk about that book? And I said, well, in general, of course, yes, I'm willing. What book do you have in mind? It was his essays on immigration. And I said, well, very well, of course, I'm perfectly prepared to speak against that book. And if you invite me, I will. And he said, well, because my name is well known. I said, well, maybe that's a good publicity. I said, okay, yes, I went. It was quite interesting because, you know, it was full. And I said, here it is, this book, which I won't recommend you to read or to buy, because A, it's a dishonest, mendacious, lying book, and B, it's a very bad book too. And nobody should read it. Okay, thank you. And I sat down, that was it. And that was my speech. So, I mean, yes, that's okay. So I solved it with a joke. But I mean, how on earth is this possible? So not Slavoj himself, people make mistakes. But how is it possible that a great number, I mentioned him because he's from here, but that people would do such things and go on as if nothing has happened. So that's the problem. Not that he has made a mistake. We all do. That's okay. Even such egregious, very. So and that's the answer. So our moral sensibility and our capacity to be indignant and to be judgmental and to condemn and to be self-critical seems to have gone to the dogs. Hence, some things are not as justified as they ought to be. Yes. Yes, I share your preoccupation. It is a problem. I too voted in the Hungarian elections. You know, I took the instructions of the opposition. I said, why make a fuss? They finally made a compromise in my district, so I voted for the Green Party's, the LMP Party's candidate. Unspeakable, reactionary idiot. Okay, very well. So, I mean, yes, because of course it was a vote against Orbán. Okay, very well. But I mean, how long should we do this? Of course, this is the well-known problem of all electoral systems. And indeed, it shouldn't last indefinitely. We shouldn't spend our life making unprincipled compromises. They may be made once or twice if indeed political necessity, but it should be called an unprincipled compromise. And questions such as yours about is being justified should be raised. So that's the minimum. So quite right in asking this question. Thank you.
Thank you again.